So, news from the bleeding edge. Oh, that's me. No, you're good. So, we generally start off with our little browser check-in. This is how the browsers looked version-wise last month. This month, not too exciting. Chrome did have an update. The reason Edge there is in dev mode and has a little asterisk, we've talked about it before, so we're not going to talk about it this month, but if you're not aware, they've actually abandoned their own rendering engine after decades, and they've adopted the same underlying engine that Chrome and Firefox use, Chrome and Safari use. So that's why they are not actually publicly released yet. They're in sort of, they call it insider releases, I think. So they're in that mode. So we'll have more to talk about on them when they finally release all that. So Chrome 76 came out. Progressive web app improvements. They had multiple features that were related to that. So if you're in the world of doing kind of mobile optimized applications, that's going to be interesting news for you. I'm not going to go into the details of it. Chrome also added dark mode support. So if you're not on Mac, you may not be familiar with that, but the Mac operating system introduced this mode where all the applications can be in dark mode. And Chrome, Firefox, and Safari had already started supporting it in the last few months. So this is the first release where Chrome finally supports it as well. The cool thing is it's really easy to implement. It's just a really simple CSS rule that you can tell your styles that if dark mode is activated, you can basically serve an alternate set of style rules. And if it's not supported, that'll just be ignored. So it's really nice because it's a progressive enhancement that won't break anything to add it. But if you happen to be running on an operating system that supports it, then you can optimize your site for that. And now it's supported across all the major browsers aside from Edge, but it will be once Edge finally releases. So that's something that you can start using today. Safari we're not really going to talk about, but I just wanted to mention it's actually very close to the next release because Safari releases come out when the Mac OS releases, and that'll be coming out next month actually. So you actually can access kind of preview releases of it if you're interested in it, but we'll talk more about it after it actually comes out publicly. Has anyone ever used this framework, Mithril, or heard of it even? So, a couple of people. I have never used it, but it's kind of an interesting framework, particularly if you're interested in small package size or performance. So like mobile would be a really good use case for this. It's actually interesting. It doesn't have a lot of the abstractions that some of the other frameworks have. It's actually still completely just written in old school JavaScript ES5 syntax. You don't have to transpile it. Their whole philosophy is keep it simple, stupid. The entire core library is 10 kilobytes minified. It's actually very similar to React, but it doesn't have JSX and all the niceties of React. It's kind of like the old original kind of syntax that, like the plain JavaScript syntax that React used originally. So anyway, that came out 2.0. I always mention that on these major releases of these libraries, if you haven't ever used them before, it's always a good time to check them out. Electron also came out with a major release. Not actually super interesting from a feature standpoint, but they've updated to the latest Chrome and Node. Just to call out, if you are using Electron, there are a few breaking changes in this release, so just be aware of that. And React, it's kind of a minor release by version number, but it's something to be aware of if you're using React, that one of the nice things that they included in this one is this profiler. So it's a component that you can wrap around your existing components to add really simple profiling. And so you can kind of use it to make sure that you're not introducing any sort of performance issues into your code, that kind of thing. So a few industry headlines. GitHub introduced the concept of actions a little while back, and that's basically just some kind of automation and workflow stuff where you can tie actions to events that might happen within your code base within your repo. Now they've added CI and CD, which is continuous integration, continuous deployment. So that's pretty cool. That kind of gets into the territory of tools like, Travis or Circle CI, where all within GitHub you can actually create an automation flow that triggers your unit tests and triggers your code coverage, and sort of you get the whole pipeline of stuff right within GitHub. It also integrates with the GitHub package registry, which is something we talked about a few months ago. So that's kind of a way to package up your code into deployable chunks within GitHub, kind of like think like NPM, but sort of built into your own repo structure. And if you have public repos like open source, like we're going to talk about later, it's actually free. This is actually kind of important if you do web development. So WebKit published this policy just recently, a few days ago, and Mozilla has an existing policy that's very similar. WebKit basically copied it and sort of expanded upon it. They're really cracking down on basically Google's business model and Facebook's business model. So you can read the goals. They sort of go into great lengths in the document about how they define terms like covert tracking, cross-site tracking. It's basically like if you're on a site and you're on the domain and you as a user sort of do some interaction that indicates that you're actually opting in to whatever that domain's doing, that's generally okay, but pretty much everything else is not. So think of all the use cases around how cookies are used across sites for tracking you through ads and all that kind of fun stuff that Facebook and Google do. WebKit and Mozilla are cracking down on that, and so that's going to get really interesting because it's not just advertising, but there's cases that are legitimate, like the way OAuth works across domains and a lot of other things that could be impacted. And so it's an interesting read if you go read the policy. They basically say, we are going to try really hard not to break existing workflows and things that users want to do, but they're prioritizing privacy and sort of not allowing this cross-site tracking potentially at the expense of the way we currently do things on the web. So it's not going to affect anything just yet today, but it's very important to be aware of it because it could potentially actually impact stuff that you're building. So just FYI. And this was kind of interesting, also potentially important in a different way. Domino's, the pizza company, actually got sued for violating the accessibility law, the ADA, and they actually lost. They got sued for like millions of dollars, and they lost. The court agreed with the person suing them that their pizza checkout experience needs to be fully accessible. So Domino's, on the grounds of complexity and cost and undue burden, is appealing it all the way to the Supreme Court. They're also basically making the argument that the ADA, that the particular portion, Title III of the ADA, was written 20-something years ago, prior to all these web interactions that we now are used to. And so they're basically arguing that that law is out of date and shouldn't apply. So, if you deal with accessibility at all, you know how big of a deal that is. And so this could be potentially a big case, depending on which way it goes, in terms of disability rights on the web. So something to kind of keep your eye on, maybe. In case you missed it, Microsoft put out this really cool site where they have a ton, I can't remember the exact count, it was over 1,000 code samples across all kinds of different languages, mostly Microsoft stack technologies, but if you're in that world, it could be very interesting to you. If you're not aware, Microsoft actually bought GitHub, so there's deep integration into GitHub. You can download the source files, and in fact, a lot of them offer one-click deploy to Azure to be able to run like hosted examples for free, which is pretty cool. Also, JS13K has begun. So this is a competition, a JavaScript competition that's been around since like 2012, I believe. And it started this week, and it's running through next month. And so it's kind of interesting. It's basically in 13 kilobytes or less of JavaScript, what can you develop? And every year they have a theme. So this theme is back, whatever that means. To give you an example, an idea, so here's last year's winner. So bear in mind, this is 13K of JavaScript. Let's see if I have some. So if you think you can build something like this in 13K of JavaScript, you might be able to win a prize. Sorry, I had this loaded earlier. I thought it was not going to take too long. It's worth it though. Maybe it's telling me it's not actually working. Anyway, it's a little shoot 'em up game. It's similar to like Doom. Basically, you can run around and shoot monsters in this 3D maze. Again, the game itself. Oh, there we go. Loaded. So there we go. I can run around this maze and shoot stuff. So that's the thing. 13 kilobytes of JavaScript. That's tiny. So that's pretty cool. Sorry, I have it. There we go. Hello. I lost my. I think I actually did kill it. Okay, cool. Sorry, let's get back into that real quick. By the way, here's our site. You can go to our site, access all of our old presentations. All right, so back into it. There's another competition that also started a couple of weeks ago. It's running through the end of this month. It is a kind of distributed online hackathon, but it's kind of interesting. There's lots of hackathons, but this is the first one I've seen that had this specific topic, the Climate Fixathon. So it's basically build something along the lines, using the theme of restoring the climate of our planet. So if you're interested, it might be a cool thing to check out. You can register today and go sort of learn more about it. As a side note, if you haven't heard about that, there's this thing that scientists have been tracking for a little while called Earth Overshoot Day. And that's basically from January 1st to December 31st. There's a day at which once we pass that day, we cannot make up for the resources that we used up till that day. We can't restore or regenerate the resources. So today, this year, that day was July 29th. So basically, we are now, from now till the end of the year, we're in sort of, ecological deficit, if you want to say it that way. So a little depressing, but kind of, a good thing to be aware of. And if that does, there's a meetup or a hackathon for that. Upcoming events. So this is worth calling out just because it's actually a huge event if you're in the Vue world, and it's actually going to be in Austin in next year. I guess that's probably around South by, first week of March, usually around close to South by. It's not open for registration yet, but the call for proposals will be opening in a couple of weeks, and I'm sure registration will happen sometime after that. So if you're in the Vue world, you really should check this out. It's in Austin. You don't have a good excuse not to. Ted will be there, probably, right?
I went to the New Orleans one. It was awesome.
Nice.
Really great.
Now for something completely different. Apollo 11. You all know Apollo 11, right? We went to the moon back in 1969. The source code that helped us achieve that is now open source on GitHub, actually. It's written in assembly. And the funny thing about it is there are Easter eggs in the code. So I'm not going to spoil it, but there's like all kinds of funny little comments that people made back in the 60s. These programmers were, I guess bored and their eyes were bleeding from writing assembly code. And so to lighten the mood, they put in all these little Easter eggs. There's also an online simulator, but before you get too excited, it's not like visually, it's not like Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's like this control panel thing, but like somehow you can simulate using those instruments if you're into that. Pretty cool. On the lighter side, I always try to throw in something fun at the end. So we actually, in a previous talk, I linked to this thing, which was in the URL bar of the browser, you can actually do these animated emoji things, and that was pretty cool. Let's let me not close the same browser again. What did I do last time? Yeah, that's the mistake I made. So the same guy now has this new thing. He basically wanted to take it up a level. So one URL bar wasn't enough. It's hard to explain, but it launches multiple browser windows stacked on top of each other with multiple URL bars, and he coordinates across all those windows to create these little interactive things. So it's better shown than explained. So for example, this is Donkey Kong. Unfortunately, the command plus thing doesn't work very well, but here's what I can do. I can sort of do this. All right, so here I am. I don't know if you can tell. So this is 7 browser windows to minimum height stacked, and these are the URL bars that you would type a website URL into, and it's using emojis. And all these windows are coordinated so that I can play this Donkey Kong game. I was hoping to save the princess. But anyway, you get the idea. That's like, it's insane that this guy figured out how to do this. And there's other ones too, so I'm not going to go through them all. There's Breakout, and actually, I will show you one more because this one is actually pretty cool. So this one is a 3-dimensional maze, kind of like a Doom-style maze. So I'm actually walking through the maze like this. It has a render, so you can sort of visualize what's happening via emojis. So here I am, you can see the maze. So there you go, you're welcome. Now you all know that that exists. And with that, I think I'm done with this part of my talk. So I'm going to turn it over to Corey for his lightning talk, and then I'll be back to talk about open source. Thanks.
No clip, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
Have a good one, Corey. Continue,
Yeah,
brother.
see you.
All right, so IAM. Anybody familiar with IAM in general? Just high-level concepts, a couple of iffies. Okay, so in a nutshell, IAM is identity and access management, or identity and authentication management. Think in terms of security, but we're not talking in terms of security, like we're not talking encryption or things like that. We're talking access control. So that's kind of what this library is all about. And just to kind of set the stage here a little bit, I've been working on a number of new applications, mostly for clients over the last couple of months. Same issue always comes up over and over. It's how do you control access to a particular view, a particular piece of a website, a particular endpoint on an API, all kinds of different things that you need to restrict access to. And I kept coming across the same issue over and over, which is when you're doing access control, you're really asking the system a question. You're asking the question of whether or not somebody has access, but this question here on screen, and I'm going to read this for a reason here. It says, is the user authorized to use this feature, or are they part of a group that can access this feature, or have they been explicitly denied access to a feature, or are they part of a group that's part of another group that has access to the feature, or are there access overrides on the feature, or do they have the right to do what they want to do on the feature? Now, if you're epileptic, turn away for a second, because to me, this is what that all sounds like. It's just crazy. Like there's a lot of just way too much logic there to think about. And so as I thought about this problem, I thought, well, and I'll just say that one of the issues that we had was that we had access, or like somebody was able to access a part of the website that they weren't supposed to be able to access. And then the question is, well, why? And it was because permissions weren't applied appropriately. And to me, it just seems like it's a lot easier to just ask the question that you actually mean of your system, which is, does the user have the right to use the system resource? So that may be, does the user have, well, here, can the user create an article on the blog? That's a very simple question that your code should be able to answer with a binary answer, yes or no. So the key to this is making sure that your system is set up the right way. Now, anybody use AWS in here? Amazon Web Services, Azure, Google Cloud, all that kind of stuff. They're all leveraging IAM for a lot of their security, but IAM in general, if you're not familiar with it, it focuses on identifying resources in your system that you want to control access to, and then the rights or permissions associated with that are all broken down into roles. So and the key here is in this library, we also have the concept of groups. And that's what makes this different from traditional IAM. When you have roles, you just have role after role after role, and people tend to think more in terms of groups. So for example, administrators. That would be a role, but are you an administrator of all parts of your website or just a certain piece? And so there's no real distinction there, and what ends up happening is you have this giant list of roles, and you often get lost in, well, what role does this user belong to, or what collection of roles do they need to get in order to achieve the access control that I'm looking for. And so the point here that I'm trying to make is that by separating roles and groups, we can achieve this fairly simplistic code here, which is, does the user have the right to use the resource that they're asking for? And so that's the point of this library. That all said, it takes a little bit of structuring to put it together. And I am going to go through a demo of this, so if you're not following all this, don't worry too much. But the concept of a resource is really anything that you define as the developer. So in this case, I'm just kind of demoing a simple blog, and this particular library, you can import this, and if anybody's familiar with any of my code, this is the first time I've actually released an ESM only module. Typically I'll do like a lot of different ways, but this is all using the new or the newer syntax here. So it doesn't work entirely with older libraries unless you do some build process or some transpilation. But anyhow, that's kind of more of an aside. The point here is that it's really easy to identify and create resources. So in this case, a blog is a resource. On that blog, we're assigning a couple of rights: create, read, update, delete, the typical CRUD operations. These can be anything that you want, that you have full control over what you call your resources. You have full control over the rights. So like a lot of the apps that I've been working on, I actually have like view and manage because it just doesn't require as many permissions. But by defining your system first, that gives you a structure to work from. Then you can use roles. This library has an all role that is kind of all-encompassing for any user that's registered on the system. So you can think of it as a built-in everyone role. So in this case, everybody can read the blog. That's fine. You can also do privileged roles or any other type of specific role. So like the administrator here has access to do all of those CRUD operations that were defined in the last slide. To take this a little bit further so that you can see how it can start to get more complex but hopefully still be simple. In this first example up here, I've defined a secret portal. So just a pretend secret portal, and we are by default denying everyone access and all rights. Nobody has access to that. But then if you look at the second block of code here, the privileged user, the administrator, has the ability to read and the ability excuse me, to manage that secret portal. Now, if you were writing your code without some sort of library to take all this into consideration, you'd be doing, well, if the user is an admin, then allow them in. If they're not an admin, then are they in a role that or a group that has permissions to do this? It gets back to that original nasty-looking, gnarly question. And again, that's not very understandable when you're writing code. So moving forward, the separation here is in with groups. So IAM, you can create any number of groups that you want. In this case, got a blog masters role, group, writer and reader. You can assign roles to entire groups. So in this case, the blog masters are assigned to they're given administrator. The role is applied to the group instead of an individual user. And that means that you have the flexibility to grant a user access to the blog masters group, and they will inherit all of those permissions. So it's really a separation of concerns that this library provides, and that gets down to the point of the user, where you can create an arbitrary user, give it a name. That's an optional thing, which you'll see in the demo in just a second. And this last line here, the user.join. This allows you to join a particular role. You can also, a particular group. You can also assign it a particular role. And again, this is all about separation of concerns. What this means is that you can create your system. You define your system first. Then you define the groups and how you want your system to be accessed. Then you start assigning users into those roles, as opposed to developing your code for a user and then going back and saying, oh, well, this user should have access to this, but not to that. It's just kind of, you end up creating confusion if you don't structure it in this type of format. And this is honestly how Amazon Web Services, Google, all these organizations use a similar type of structure. It gets a little bit deeper rooted. The reason that I like groups is because it actually focuses more on an LDAP concept. If you're unfamiliar with that, if you work for pretty much anyone, you're most likely leveraging Active Directory, which is based on LDAP. It's a system of organizational units and groups, and that's how maybe your rights are restricted in your corporate environment. It's a very, very popular way of securing entire corporate environments. It's not as useful on the web. LDAP doesn't scale quite the way that that would work for an application that has millions of users. But the point here is that there are two different types of security. There's IAM, and then there's kind of this LDAP style. The purpose of this library is to merge the best of those worlds together to make it very simple to structure your applications and restrict who can see what. So again, getting back to, this is the type of question that we want to be asking of our code. Is the user authorized to see something or not? And if so, act accordingly. Yeah, you got a question?
Yeah, so what happens like if you want to say like the blog owner can edit his own blog, so the role isn't quite static like in your example?
So the question is, what if the role is not static? Like what if it changes? This library supports dynamic updates, so you could create a blog owner role if you want and only assign it to that one user. You can do that on the fly if you feel like it. You can pre-structure it, but it does have the ability to accommodate that. More importantly though, if you had a blog owner, which may be different or differentiated from a blog administrator, you can assign a user to any number of groups. You can assign them to any number of roles. You can assign a role to any number of groups, and you can have groups within groups. So the point is, if that sounds like a total craziness, that's because it is. But the point of the library is to handle all of that for you so that you're always coming back and asking this question: do I have access or not? So that said, I kind of anticipated, what would you actually say this library does? And I think it's best to see this in code. Whoops. All right, and this is all on GitHub. There will be a link at the end of the presentation. Here is a fairly simple UI that I whipped up based on this library. And let's see, we'll get the code here. Okay. So here you can see, is this large enough to see in the back? Hopefully. All right, so in this little app here, we've just got a home link, that's what we're on. We've got a blog and we've got an editor. And then up here, I just have a couple of users defined for demonstration purposes. So there are really three components. Again, the home screen, the blog, and the editor. The home screen, we've defined a resource that says you can view it. The blog, we have view and edit. I have allowed everything, anybody can see the home page. The blog, by default, you can view it, but you are not allowed to edit the blog. And just to illustrate that, well, actually here, let me show you the user definition. So skip some of these other things for a moment. Down here, these highlighted lines saying a new IAM user, calling them John Doe, not assigning any rights, not doing anything at all. That's who we're currently looking at on the left side of the screen. So when I click on the blog, I should be allowed to see it, and I can. When I click on the editor, I get an error that says that I can't access that particular page. And I want to draw your attention to something here. And if you can't see this in the back, it says, sorry, John Doe, you aren't authorized to see that section. The edit right on the blog resource is denied by the everyone role. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because this library has what I call a lineage tracer. You can find out by just running a trace to say, why does this user have permission or why don't they have permission? And I'll illustrate that in a second here. If we switch over to the almighty blogmaster role, when we click on the editor, you can actually see what's in that section. That particular user is defined the same way. So it's just another user. And in this particular case, I added this user to a group, but you can see in this commented code that we could just assign that user to the administrator role. In this particular case, though, what I've done, again, this is a little bit contrived for example purposes, but we've created on line 40 here, created this administrator group, created a couple of other groups, added members, again, just to illustrate the fact that you can assign a group to a group. And then we assigned the admin group the administrator role. And then we took the admin user and joined it to the administrator group. As a result of this, on this screen here, on the left, this is actually a dump of what the user has access to. They are a member of the administrator group, and as a result, they've automatically inherited the administrator role. And that's really, again, the power of this library, is that it understands the inheritance chain. It knows how to deny things when it should be denied. It knows how to allow things when it should be allowed. And again, the code to actually see whether or not this user is allowed to see something or do something is, hopefully I can get this fully on the screen. It's right here. So we're saying if the current user, which I just set to whoever is selected, is authorized to see the particular resource that they're requesting, and do they have the appropriate permission. If the answer is true, then it just bypasses this. If the answer is that they don't have authorization, then it pops up that little window and says you're not allowed to look at this. And that little message that told you why you're not allowed to look at it is from this. Whoops. Yeah, let me see if I can get that highlighted. It's this line right here. So it returns, again, a trace, which is a whole object that you can look at. You could do anything you want with this, and that's kind of, go back to these slides here. This is the actual output from that lineage object. So you can see here there's a couple of different ways to look at this. It will show you here the chain of rights that led to, hey, do I have the right to view this or not? It will actually, it was a little bit too big to put in here, so this is the text description that it'll provide you of whether or not you have permission, and then it provides you the entire stack trace. So that if you were to be putting together a reporting system, or like I've been working on users that just, hey, does this user have rights? So you have full control is the whole point of this library. So that's where I'm going to leave it, I think, here. This works in both the browser as well as in Node. It's all up on GitHub, so you can check it out. It's at my GitHub. I'm Corey Butler, just /IAM. You can ping me on Twitter if you have any questions. If you decide to use it, I'd love to know. But that's basically IAM in a nutshell, and what I've been working on for the last week or so here. So that's about it. Actually, if you want me to, I can go through the Node example, but I'm assuming you got enough. Okay.
I think we're good.
All right. It's kind of a good segue since he just showed an open source library that he's actively writing. Everyone can do open source. How many people have written their own open source project? A few. How many have contributed open source? Everyone's probably used open source. We're going to talk about that. Who am I? Brian Mosque, currently VP of Engineering at Aunt Bertha. I mentioned that earlier. I'm also organizer of this meetup. And there's my GitHub. So I have a little bit of stuff on my GitHub as well that's open source that you can check out. I mentioned before Aunt Bertha. I also mentioned that we're hiring. So just to start off, to show you that I've actually done a little bit of this before, some open source that I've worked on. This was probably the biggest one. So EXTJS long ago was a popular JavaScript framework. It actually still exists. These days it's more of a corporate kind of Fortune 500 thing that most people don't pay as much attention to if they're not in that world. But back in 2007, 2008, when it was brand new, it was a fairly popular framework. So another developer and I sort of, launched it, made a company out of it. And so, yeah, spent a lot of time working on that. That was what you see here. That is actually not a window on like a Windows desktop. That entire thing you're seeing is all JavaScript. So this was a demo that we made using all components from our framework to give you an idea of what it was all about. And then after that, I actually spent a little bit of time after I left that company building components using the same framework, but doing my own sort of projects. And so the big one that I worked on was this calendar project, and the company name was Extensible. And again, built sort of a Google Calendar style calendar view with a bunch of different views in it, and it was pretty complicated. All JavaScript, all open source. So that's a little bit of my background. In my opinion, every developer should contribute to open source. That's just kind of my opinion about that. I don't think there's any reason why you shouldn't, and in fact, I think there's a lot of good reasons why you should. And so that's what I'm going to talk about and try to convince you. If you're not doing that, I'm going to try to convince you that you should be. So why is that? Well, number one, flat out, it will improve your skills. And that may not be logical, because if you're just taking code and you're just putting it in a different place, like what does that have to do with your skill? But don't underestimate sort of, as soon as you make something public, it's kind of the principle of the best way to learn something is to try to teach it, right? It's the same exact thing. As soon as you make your code public, the very first time someone logs an issue on your repo or asks you a question about how something works, all of a sudden you're like, oh, good point. And then you start thinking about why you made that decision, and maybe you do it a little differently. It encourages you to try to write nice code and not just slap stuff together. So you'll become a better coder if you do that. It's also a great way to build a portfolio. I actually gave a talk previously about kind of getting a job, and one of the things I talked about was open source in that talk. It's actually a great way if you're a younger developer or any time in your career, if you're sort of on the market looking for a job. There's no better way to prove what you can code than to actually literally point someone at your code, right? So it's a great way to build up a portfolio of your skill set. it's actually a great way to get a job in open source. So probably the best example of that, at least in the JavaScript world recently, is this guy Dan Abramoff. And if you haven't heard his name, he's the guy that wrote Redux originally, which is a state manager for React. So originally, back in probably 3 or 4 years ago, no one had ever heard of this guy. And all of a sudden, he shows up at JSConf in Europe to demo Redux for the first time. And it's open source, of course. And he starts contributing back to the React repo, because React is open source. He starts kind of interacting there. And all of a sudden, what do you know, Facebook hired him. And now he's like the lead engineer on React. Now, he's of course an outlier. But in my personal example, you know, I just told you about EXTJS. In the early days of that project, when we started building our community, when we decided to try to make a company out of it and try to sort of commercialize it a little bit, guess where we found the first 5 to 10 developers that we hired? Every single one of them came through our community. They were the people that were commenting, contributing patches, helping other people. Those are the best people because they're demonstrating it, right? They're not just talking about it, and we hired them. So it's a great strategy to think about. It's also a good way from the perspective of someone like me, right? I'm an experienced developer. I've done lots of open source. So it's a great way for me to actually teach good practices to other developers. That could be people on my team, or it could be people just, you know, in the public community. It's a very great way to give feedback on code through code reviews. You end up interacting with people through comments, and it's a great way to just sort of, you know, give back a little bit through best practices. And again, this is pretty obvious based on what I've been talking about, but engage a community. It doesn't have to be your own open source community. Like any one of us here could go show up on React's repo, start commenting, start submitting patches. Now all of a sudden you're part of that community, and hopefully you're being helpful. It's a great way to do that. So a quick case study. Sinon Bluebird, this is a code package that actually a developer on my team a while back, this was several years ago now, we ended up open sourcing this package. And what it is, so Sinon, if you're not familiar with it, is this library for in sort of unit testing in that world. It provides mocking and stubbing and some other things that make testing easier. Bluebird is a promise-based library. So that's just sort of a style in JavaScript and other languages. You can do callbacks or you can do promises. So I'm not going to get into that, but this is a promise library that at the time was really popular in Node. And we were using both of them independently, but at the time, Sinon did not support a callback, or sorry, a promise style API, which was kind of annoying because like we were writing all this other code using promises, but then when we had this Sinon-based code, we had to write callback style, which was like the old style. So the developer on my team that was getting annoyed about that, he decided to sort of fix that and write a little wrapper. It's basically not a ton of code. It was a few simple functions. I think the total code was like 80 lines or so at the time. But it was basically just wrapping this existing library with this promise API just to make the ergonomics of using it a little nicer and more consistent. Originally, it was just a little utility file, and it was just kind of baked into our code base. You know, the dependencies were such that it was sort of like part of our application. But it was good, and it worked well. And I looked at it, and the funny thing is, so I think the way this went is he went off, wrote that code, PR'd it within our private project, and I looked at that PR and I said, hey, this is great. This seems really useful. Like, we should consider sharing this, open sourcing it. Todd was initially unconvinced. So Todd was my developer, and he was kind of like, hey man, like this PR is good to go. All you need to do is accept it, and then we'll move on. Like, why are you asking me to do extra work? It's, you know, his opinion was it's just this simple little throwaway class, 80 lines of code. I was just scratching an itch, like it's not a big thing, right? I said, you know what? Here's the deal. If it's scratching an itch for you, I guarantee you it's probably going to scratch that same itch for other people who happen to be using this library and happen to be wanting to do promises. And I finally kind of corralled him into agreeing with me. So what that entailed was cleaning up the code first off. I mean, it wasn't bad code, but it was sort of like, okay, if I'm going to actually expose this publicly, I probably need to sort of clean up the syntax a little bit, clean up the white space, you know, add a few comments because people are now actually looking at the source code and reading it in theory. We actually were already unit testing, but again, it's like that extra level of scrutiny is like, well, okay, if people are going to be using it for real, let's add these extra cases and let's make it nice, right? One thing we did not have was documentation, because normally for just internal utility code that you write, you're not generally writing like user documentation. That added a little bit of effort, but we did that. We added docs for it. And of course, we moved it into a dedicated repo, so that involved sort of breaking a few dependencies, you know, moving the code over and shipping it to its own named repo. So that was a bit of extra work, right? And then we got all that done, and then we created an organization on NPM. NPM published it, you know, bam. On the first day, it got 44 downloads, and I think NPM sort of like boosts, you know, new projects or something like that, because you could see it dropped off. But after the first week, we had gotten 122 downloads of this little throwaway code that Todd wrote. And I was like, hey man, you know, this is amazing. And Todd was basically feeling like this, right? He was like, oh my God, it's incredible. Like all these people are using my code. You know, he had never done that before. Within the first 3 months, it got downloaded almost 700 times. And at the peak in this time frame, in 1 week, it got downloaded 129 times. So again, this was completely, in his mind, throwaway code that was just like code that he just dashed off to solve a little quick problem, and that was it. Well, he solved that same problem for 700 people in the first 3 months, which is pretty awesome, right? So after that, we kind of moved on to other things, right? Because like it was like, you know, 700 downloads, cool, whatever, and we sort of forgot about it. The company actually ended up going out of business. For the purpose of this talk, I went back and I looked up the current stats because it's still out there, it's still open source. So this was published in March of 2015. So who has a guess where we are today? Yeah.
5,000?
5,000. It's higher than that. Anyone else? No one?
12,000.
12,000? So in 4 years, that little piece of crap, 80 lines of code that Todd had to be convinced was useful as open source has been downloaded almost 200,000 times. In May of this year, it peaked at 8,200 downloads. Pretty cool. This is what we ended up with. We actually ended up with a little NPM company page with several packages. That was by far our most popular. But after convincing Todd and the other folks on my team that that was a useful approach, we actually started doing that with other packages. We actually started looking for opportunities to take units of code, pulling them out of our application and open sourcing them. And again, that's the most popular one, but every single one of these has been downloaded by hundreds or thousands of developers. So pretty cool. Now, not only is that useful to us as a company because it made our code better, it also gave us a page on NPM that people can find our company, and that's good for the company, sort of marketing and branding. It's also good for Todd. So Todd is now off somewhere else working for some other company. Todd can point back to this and, you know, if he's looking for a job or showing someone what he can do, he can pull up that code right now on GitHub and he can say like, here's code I wrote that's being used by 200,000 developers. That's pretty awesome, right? And it was pretty simple. If we wanted to do something like that, how would we begin, right? There's lots of great resources for how to approach open source. This one is a really good site. This is actually put together by GitHub. GitHub being GitHub, of course, they want to encourage open source. There's tons of stuff. I'm not going to click through all of it. These are all clickable to other pages that have additional resources. But it's kind of like an A to Z of starting off with how do you actually do it? How do you start your own project? You know, how do you build communities and all the rest of it? So this is a great sort of just general educational resource about how to approach open source. If you're ready to actually try yourself contributing to open source, there's lots of great resources specifically for that. So there's this one called Contribute to This Project. This is pretty cool because this is not where they're not actually literally asking you to contribute. This is a project you can pull down, and the whole point of the project is to teach you how to contribute to an open source project. So it actually walks you through step by step, you know, how to fork this repo, how to do all the steps, how to make the change, how to commit it, etc. So really simple step by step. Once you're kind of used to the process of doing it, then you can go to resources like upforgrabs.net. And so this is one where you can basically say, you know what, I'm interested in, let's say, I don't know if they have JavaScript in here. Maybe it's a tag. Yeah, so I'm interested in JavaScript. So in open source repos, it's very common to use labels to indicate lots of different things, but there's certain labels that are commonly understood to be good beginner-friendly labels that are encouraging open source contribution. So for example, help wanted, up for grabs, help wanted. So these are the actual labels in these repos. So anyway, the resources you can filter by the name of the project or by the technology, find projects that are, you know, things that you're interested in, and actually find things that are available to be worked on really easily.
Is up for grabs like you become the primary maintainer?
No, so the way it works, this is just sort of a directory for finding things. And so then, for example, if you go to the actual repo here, then you can go to the issues list and you can actually find the issue here. So like the help wanted one that was linked from over there. And then you can sort of go into the issue and find out what it's about and join in the discussion, whatever you want to do at that point. But this side is just the directory that kind of pulls all of them together. GitHub itself actually has a built-in system that they call topics that you can use to explore. It's basically tied to their labels, but they call it topics because they pull all of the label together into one sort of topic-like view. But a good one is actually good first issue. So you can search GitHub for that label, and it actually gives you the list of projects right here. And so again, same thing, you can try to find one that you're interested in. Like that issue looks interesting, so I'm going to click on it, go into it, and then, you know, go from there. And again, we're going to, in a second, we're going to talk about like how to actually take the next step. But this is right now just about finding things. There's also this command line interface, this project that you can install yourself called Good First Issue that I'm going to demo here in just a second. And then once you're past kind of the learning stage, then there are also resources that are more about just finding projects in general, not specifically about good first issues or beginner stuff, but just finding, you know, more like the projects that you want to work on. So for example, there's big time projects like Angular, Elasticsearch, you know, Docker. And so you can click on here and you can actually get a list of issues in the Elasticsearch open source project. Oh, that's interesting. That's a bug in the site. So we'll ignore that for a second. Let's click on another one. There we go. So you get the idea. It's the same basic concept. Oh, these guys have 3,000 issues, so they need some help. So I mentioned Good First Issue. This is kind of cool. You can install it locally as a little command line application, and you can say Good First Issue and then the name of a repo, and it'll actually go find the first one, you know, usually sorted by date that it was updated or something along those lines. Now I'm going to do the cardinal sin of presenting and try a live demo, although Corey's went well, so I have high hopes that mine will go well. I'm going to actually, if this works correctly, we are actually, all of us together are going to make an open source contribution right here. Are y'all with me?
Yep.
All right, so first I wanted to show you this little thing. So this is good first issue that I just mentioned. So the cool thing is, if you don't know a project, you can just type good first issue, enter, and then it gives you this little picker, and you can scroll through it, and you can find a project, and then there's a random issue. So I said, I feel lucky. It just picked one randomly. And so here's some health checker repo with some issue. So that's pretty cool. One thing I noticed is that good first issue itself, let's see, Gatsby, Gutenberg, good first issue itself, the library, doesn't show up in this list. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because the whole purpose of the tool is to find good first issues. And so I went to their repo. Let's see. So this is the repo of the tool that we're using. And I went to the issues list. Oh, there it is, yeah. Good first issue. So this repo has a good first issue, but it doesn't show up in its own tool, which I thought was kind of funny, right? And so my thought was, why don't we do a contribution to this tool to add the support for it to be able to find its own good first issues? That might be kind of fun. So how do we do that? And I actually just have a little bit of notes. I'm not totally cheating, but I want to make sure I don't miss a step, because it does take a few little steps. But the first thing we're going to do when you want to contribute is you go to the repo that you're interested in, and the best approach is to fork it. So what that means is you're saying, I want to take this entire repo and create a copy of it, basically stick it in my own GitHub account, and be able to treat it as if it's my own personal repo. But because it's a fork, you'll see that up here it shows up as B Mosque good first issue forked from the original upstream repo. So it's very clear that it's a fork. I didn't write it, but it gives me a way to work on it. So now it's in my area. I can pull it down. I can work on it without affecting the original project. So the first thing now that I want to do to be able to work on it locally is I want to clone it down to my local machine so that I can work on it, right? So you can basically grab this little URL for cloning, and let me make sure I'm in the right place. I'm in projects, so I'm going to git clone, and I'm going to pull down my repo. So again, just to be clear, we're pulling down my fork, not the original repo. That way I can work on it, and I don't have to worry about messing anything up. All right. So now I have the code down locally on my machine. Now the best thing to do before you get started, so you don't waste time, is to go back to the original code or the original repo. And most repos that are encouraging contributions usually have some kind of contributing guide. Contributing.md is very common, and they'll often link to it like this. So I'm going to come here, and I'm going to take a look at what they have to say about contributing. So use a descriptive commit message, that's fine. Make sure you test it before you push it, that's fine. And what you're looking for is, here we go. So what we're trying to do is add a new project. In this case, they actually have specific instructions, so that's kind of what we're looking for, right? So how do we add a new project to this thing? So to add a new project, all we have to do is update this file, projects.json. We add the project to it, and then we update the README file, so that it shows up on the main page, and that's pretty much it. And then we can kind of go through the rest of the process and push it up there. So cool. We're going to come over to the code, and I'm going to code that period, which is just going to take my current folder and open it in VS Code, just so that we can edit it a little bit more nicely. All right, so this is the project that we just pulled down, and they said to go into projects.json and edit this, right? So let's see, EFG. So it looks like we just need to add a section that looks like this, specific to the project that we want to support. So we're going to do that. We're going to add good first issue. Good first issue. And then the repo is going to be the, going back to the original thing. So this is the original repo, Qt-node/good first issue. So that's the repo that we want to search for issues. And the cool thing about this particular thing, we're not going to go into all the details of this, but essentially it's pretty simple. When you're on any code repo, you can, let's go back to the original. When you go into the issues list, you can search by all the different criteria that GitHub supports. So all we're actually doing is constructing that search manually with the URL parameters that it generates. And we can basically just copy this one. So it's going to be, it is an issue, it is open, and the label is good first issue, which is exactly the same as what ours is because we looked at it earlier. And then the description, I'm just going to copy from their site. So CLI for finding good first issues. And that should be it. And so then I'm not going to go back and find it in their docs, but it tells you basically how to test that it's working, right? So the way we do that is actually first we're going to npm install this code. So when you're working on, if you haven't ever worked on node style JavaScript source repos, there's dependencies that are not in the repo that you have to pull down and install. And so npm install basically found in package.json, it said, okay, this code base relies on all these other external libraries. So npm install is going to pull those down, install them in the right place, and then that'll allow me to actually run the local development version of this project. Hopefully this won't take too long. And then that way we can actually test our change, make sure that it's working correctly. We can run the tests of the project, and then we can actually push up our change. All right, so let's see if that worked. Let's see if this is running our local one. No, it's not. So I think I need to do
Probably need to build it.
npm-i g. I think so. I-g. So that's basically saying that when I run it that way, it was finding the one that I had already had installed globally. So I basically just need to install this code version globally so that that's the one it finds. So let's see if I run it this time. There we go, good first issue, right? Now it shows up in the list. When I run it, it finds issue number 1, unassigned. Is that the same one? I don't remember. Yep, issue number 1, add tests. Add tests. Cool, it works. That's awesome. The only other thing it said to do was to update the README. And so again, you'll find this in their documentation, but basically there's this command, npm run markdown. So that did a thing that it cares about. That's all we need to worry about for that. So now if I say git status, those are the 2 files that we've modified, the README and our projects file, which is exactly what we want. So now we're just going to sort of commit these changes. Obviously I did this earlier to save me some typing. So I'm committing those to Git. Now I'm going to push them back up to my fork so that now I can put it actually on GitHub. So I'm going to git push. Oh, I forgot to actually branch this. So I bet it's going to complain if I do master, but we'll see what it tells me. Cool. So now it's telling me that I can go back to the repo. So I've pushed this code up now. And if I want to, I can create a pull request. Yeah, I knew it was going to complain. So the step I missed, it's an optional step, but it's an anti-pattern to do this from master. I should have created a branch first. But I think it'll still let me do it. So here's the change that we're doing. So all of this stuff was just what that one command did. It basically inserted, right here, it inserted this line, and then it did this big change because it just renumbered it for us, but that was an automated step. And then of course our change was just adding that. So we can PR this change, add good first issue as a project. I thought it would be cool if the tool found its own good first issues by default. And if I had more time, I would spend a little more time on this, but that's what I'm going to do. And now I'm on the original repo. I have created a pull request with my change, and I have just contributed to open source. So now that's public. I just pushed it publicly to that repo. That person can take it or leave it. They may tell me to improve my description or whatever. We'll see. I'm not really sure. But now the ball is in that person's court. So there you go. I'm pretty happy that that actually worked. Sweet. So in like 10 minutes, we just started from scratch and we made an open source contribution. It's as simple as that, right? Now, obviously, it takes a little bit of practice if you haven't done it before, but that really is all there is to it as far as just finding a project that you want to support, finding a nice, easy way to contribute, and just doing it. So ideas for things to look for, even if you're not a coder or even if you don't know that code base, so maybe you're not comfortable making code changes yet, there's lots of simple ways you can contribute. As an open source maintainer myself, I can tell you the #1 complaint usually about popular projects is that their documentation sucks. Well, you know what? Fix it. If you have a project that you want to support that you use, I guarantee you if you help them improve their documentation, they will love you for it. If you happen to know another language, oftentimes projects are looking for translations of their docs, of their examples. So easy way to contribute there. You can often add a demo. So a lot of projects will have demos built in a folder. If you were to create a new demo that shows off something that they don't already have, again, they would absolutely love you for that. It's also a great way to kind of introduce yourself to a code base by trying to use it, try to build a demo, try to learn it that way. Fixing a bug is the obvious thing, but fixing a bug doesn't have to mean like making some huge complicated change. It could be a typo that you find. I've done that before actually. Yeah, it could be simple things. I actually PR'd a bug, actually, so the editor that I'm using here, that I was just typing in, VS Code, this editor is open source. And back in the early days of within a few months of when they had first released it, it still had some issues. And one of the issues that I was running into was it kept hanging, and it would just like spin, and it was unresponsive. And so I sort of dug into it a little bit, and it ended up being something really simple. I actually realized that when you're using it with Node projects that had Node modules that can get really big, it just was not handling that well. It was basically kind of going through all the Node modules in a way that sort of hung it up. And so it actually ended up being really simple because the fix wasn't even a code fix. It was just like I think it was a git ignore type, like one line of change in a configuration thing. But I was able to PR that back as a code fix to the VS Code repository, and it got accepted. And so that was pretty cool because it was like, you know, I had a sort of tangible impact on this tool that hundreds of thousands of people use. And it was pretty simple. It just took a little bit of, you know, playing around with it. Even code reviewing a PR is useful, right? Even if you're not ready to contribute code on your own, again, great way to learn the project, great way to give back. And then finally, of course, once you're a little bit more comfortable adding new features, oftentimes projects will publish feature lists or roadmaps, and they'll often make it available to say, hey, if you want to claim a feature, let us know and we'll help you work on it. Open source doesn't even have to mean code. I've mentioned a couple of things there, but like here's an example of a couple of repos that I have on my GitHub that are not even code. So one of them is a collection of useful links. So as an engineering leader myself, one of the things that I work on is engineering ladders, which is ways of working on career development with developers. And so I started running across a bunch of them and kept forgetting where they were. And so I basically just created a page on GitHub where I started linking to them. And it's hard to see, but like 13 people have starred this repo. So randomly people have found it and decided it was useful enough that they wanted to bookmark it. So that's pretty cool. And then dot files, if you do much on the command line, if you're familiar with dot files, it's pretty common in the Unix world where it's basically configuration files for lots of different types of applications. And there's a whole underworld of people who are obsessed with customizing their dot files. I wouldn't say I'm obsessed with it, but I have definitely spent probably more time than I need to messing with that. And again, it's very common to kind of share your dot file customizations through open source. And finally, just as an example of me continuing to evangelize this is my current company's page on PyPy. So again, we are a Python shop. PyPy is kind of the NPM for Python. Early days, we just have one little project, but we have open sourced. And again, this was a very similar story. A developer on my current team was writing this code, and I said, same kind of thing that I did with Todd. Hey, this seems useful. We should open source this. And he said, oh yeah, he hadn't even thought about it. So we put in a little extra effort, and here you go. We have this project on PyPy. So it's pretty fun. So hopefully I've convinced you that it is a good idea, and there's no reason not to be contributing to open source. We walked through, and I showed you how easy it is. So hopefully you'll all go home and start writing open source code. Any questions or anything? Yeah.
Just one thing, like October is coming up, and that's usually like a big open source one. You get a free T-shirt from DigitalOcean. They partner with GitHub.
Is it like called something particular?
What's that?
Is there a name like
Hacktoberfest.
Movember or whatever? So he's saying in October there's a lot of open source specific stuff that goes on, like DigitalOcean has a promotion. So yeah, I guess keep your eye out for that. Cool, if there's no other questions, we've got a little time to hang out, and then, like I said, there's drinks and stuff back there. If you feel like hanging out afterwards, we'll be downstairs. But thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.